Welcome to the Snapshots podcast, hosted and run by the Global Health Working Group as part of the British International Studies Association. This podcast gathers the personal insights and interests of global health researchers through conversations with those at its cutting edge. My name is Christopher Long, co-convenor of the BC Global Health Working Group, lecturer in international relations at Queen's University Belfast, and the host and production manager of this podcast. In this episode, we are speaking with Sophie Jung, lecturer in global health at the University of Leeds. Yeah, welcome, Sophie, to the Snapshots podcast. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you take part. So to begin the conversation, how did you find yourself working in global health? What were some of the things that interested you?
It was really during my master's program when I was allowed to write a thesis, and my supervisor was like, "Oh, you research global governance, so what you should look at is the evolving HIV/AIDS agenda." It's like, okay, as a master's student, you're like, okay, fine, that sounds good. I've got a topic, hooray, and a research question. And then I got really into it and I found it really interesting. And then just because of that one thesis, I then wanted to do a PhD on global governance of health. That's how I got into it. But one of the things I thought was really interesting about health is, the way we study global governance is that it's within these area domains. So health, environment, climate change, trade. And what I came across with this research bit on HIV/AIDS is that it is about health, but it's also not about health, right? It's about the politics and hierarchies and power relations. So that's really how I got into the subject area.
Great. So you mentioned, these politics and hierarchies. Are these some of the most important issues and questions that you've kind of investigated, and what's drawn you to these areas?
I think so, yes. Sort of it's the political nature of things, of everything, sort of the making and changing and remaking of orders, right? But from a political perspective. And whether this is sort of the macro politics of when we think about UN organizations, but also how that then links to, and this is maybe also why I find health so interesting, how it links to then individuals, right? Patient outcomes are really, really tangible, and we've all experienced it, and we've all probably experienced navigating health systems and health issues. And that is, there are underlying political currents to that as well. So I think that's something that I find really interesting. I don't know how to make sense of it completely, right? But it's a puzzle for me.
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned the kind of the link maybe between the international and the local. Is that one of the main areas that's one of the main issues that's drawn you to these areas, or is it connected to anything else?
Yes, I think so. I like to think about global governance as more than just UN institutions or international agreements, right? But more in a more holistic way that doesn't just include global governance trickling down, right? It's not just recommendations made by WHO. You know this as well. But what else is going on? Yes, and I do think it's really interesting to also see how local dynamics or different local and national contexts create and shape global governance and global governance outcomes then. And I think it also then plays into my interest in not just global governance as understood in international relations, but also the discipline of public health, because that's really where we get to hospital capacity, workforce, service delivery, right? These things that should or should not be influenced by global level, macro level decision making.
Yeah. Yeah, so I see
Yeah.
some of the issues you outlined is kind of the way that the local interacts with the international and vice versa. Is that fair
Yeah.
to how you're?
Yeah, that's a fair thing. Yes, absolutely. How do we conceptualize and bring them together?
Mm,
Right? Can we?
yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting. And has working in these areas kind of revealed any preconceived myths or like disconnects in how maybe you thought things would be organized or maybe would be working?
Yes, I think yes. It's a bit maybe of a disillusionment because when I started this, right, looking at global health, I thought, well, obviously we think about health systems,
Mm,
right, as IR researchers. But then I started dabbling in public health and was quite sort of surprised to see how we maybe use the same words, but we mean very different things.
mm,
And and public health and IR don't necessarily interlink.
mm,
And so words like health workforce, health systems functions, we don't really use them in IR.
mm, mm,
Whereas, if we say we want to conceptualize the local in the global or their interconnections, maybe we need to think a little bit more about that. And the same goes for public health. I'm often a bit struck by how political some of the things are portrayed to be.
mm,
Right? When we think about so a very common framework is the WHO's 5 building blocks of a health system.
mhm,
And governance is part of that. But it's a very different understanding of that governance. That governance is apolitical in a way compared to IR. When we talk about global governance or governance, it's politically, we know that it's politically loaded.
mm,
Or, the One Health framework is presented as quite apolitical in a way.
mm,
So, yes, I had this expectation that maybe we think and work in much more interdisciplinary ways.
mm.
And I've really noticed that working interdisciplinary is really hard as well.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
And, yeah. I think I came to realize that as I progressed in my research.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned kind of the role of language and the way that some similar terms are used, but maybe that they don't have the same meaning. And when you're kind of talking about public health context and international relations context as well, is that kind of where you find these difficulties in working interdisciplinary?
Yes, I think it's one of them, right? I think governance, but also because I come from a study of global governance, so that is already in the name.
Yeah.
Right? But so the first project I worked on with colleagues from the public health side, we always talked about governance, and it turns out we meant really different things. So when it actually got to writing the paper, I was really confused, and they were really confused with what I said, and it just didn't match up. That's definitely one of the things, but it's also really tricky to integrate different aspects into one paper, right? Because we have word limits, and public health journals tend to be even shorter pieces. It's sort of 5,000 words, for example.
Yeah.
Whereas we often get 8 or 10,000 in IR. And how do you put that much information together, and who is the audience you're really talking to? Because then, depending on what perspective academics come from, they will then criticize that paper for all the things it isn't doing, but because it can't do everything, right? No paper can. But that's something, because if you bring 2 or more disciplines together, you cannot assume that people have the background knowledge to understand what you're on about, but you can't bring all of the background in. I think that's one of the other challenges I've encountered.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting insight into working interdisciplinary. And and some of the difficulties that arise around it. Have there been any big surprises in your study of global health from when you first maybe entered the field, and some revelations or things that surprised you?
Things that surprised me. Maybe one of the things that surprised me was that maybe from an international relations perspective, the way I study global health doesn't have that much impact on real life events or policy making, right? Sort of my aspiration or wish is that my research obviously can change things.
Yeah.
Right. If we think about health, better health outcome, better care, better, I don't know. I mean, that's a big one, but could just be tiny things. And that's not always as easy to do, right? Yeah. To get to talk to the people who get to call the shots and make the decisions. And what we do really well in IR, I think, is provide a critical analysis of systems and systemic challenges. But what we don't necessarily do is provide tangible solutions, right? This problem solving.
Yeah.
Public health is, I think, a bit better at that. And a sort of, you can take that to policymakers and say, look, we need better trained staff. Just a simple fictional example. Or it has shown that taking action early on, during COVID, really helped to mitigate the burden of it in the long term. But with international relations, I was like, oh yes, maybe actually I don't have these ideas that I can really take to policymakers, because it's more like I want to change the system. It's like, yes, but how? Give me the tiny steps towards that.
Yeah.
And I had to learn that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, really interesting reflection on, maybe the discipline of international relations and working interdisciplinary and actually your subject matter as well, which obviously lends itself, you would think, quite clearly to these sorts of policy implications and, the way that you might be able to improve actually the way things work dynamically and politically. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that IR, right, and these critical analyses, they do hold a lot of value. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's maybe not always as easy to get your feet under the decision-making table.
Yeah.
And I think that surprised me a little, because I see the value. But I feel like other people, other disciplines, maybe sometimes don't quite to the extent that I do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it connects to my next question, which is, have you found many theories very powerful in developing your work, or have these theories actually maybe reinforced some of the dynamics you're talking about in lacking maybe that real world implications and policy implications?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because there's so many theories and approaches. And having dabbled in public health, there's so many frameworks, and I'm always wondering how much do they actually always help? Whom are they for? Are they only for researchers? Do they help the people actually working in the health field to make more informed decisions? Or what do we do with them, right? Are they just academic exercises? There are, yes, sort of, I think looking at the history and especially sort of imperial legacies in healthcare is really interesting, because it relates to how the system is set up, right? Sort of which includes global trade and distribution of resources. But it also links to how different bodies are treated within a healthcare system. So the very local, right? What are we trained to see? How was medicine how are doctors taught, and where is the focus, right? What do people learn about how different bodies react?
Yeah.
Gender dynamics and yeah. So I think that's a really important perspective to use when thinking about health. God, but I could go on, right? As I mentioned, gender, I think that's really important to look at.
Yeah.
Critical sort of political economy, obviously, because trade and the economics of health just play a massive role, I think.
Yeah.
I obviously I always like reading Foucault and health, but that's I think because that's where I started with, and find it really applicable and just very nice to read. Don't know if that counts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, if you're interested in it, right, I'm sure it would shape what you are trying to do. And yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting. Range of different theories, like you say, and maybe their relevance and applicability, right? And some of them are very much tied to like the empirics, right? And actually helping explain dynamics that are maybe more policy relevant or something like this. Yeah. What are some of the most kind of exciting and interesting and high priority issues that you see in the field as we kind of move forward?
As a health issue, I want to say antimicrobial resistance.
Yeah.
But that's what I look at, right? That's what I study. So
yeah.
But I think it's so important because it's a really tricky one to tackle, right? It's so diffuse. It manifests in so many different illnesses and treatments, not just communicable, but also non-communicable.
Yeah.
It often reminds me a little bit of the governance or responses to climate change. So I think that's a really pressing one. The other one, which I think is really pressing, is the distribution of resources. And I could well imagine that gets sort of worse with the impact of climate change.
Yeah.
Right. But something I find very interesting is also the role of the health sector in contributing to climate change. Because it is actually quite a big polluter. And yeah, it's something I think we need to look at as well, rather than just the impact of climate change in relation to health and the health outcomes. So these would be my, I don't know, these are the things that I find really interesting. I also find them very, very complex, especially the distribution of resources, because it's so political.
Yeah.
And how do we study this complexity and don't just say, oh, we need more money, because it's not about the more money, it's about how do we distribute that money and where do we put it, and that then becomes the political again.
Yeah, really fascinating questions. And very pressing, right? So AMR is kind of a sleeper issue, not always the front headlines, but so important. Yeah.
No, I thought there was so much media attention and research attention before COVID. And then COVID hit, and you found, little side notes or papers, but there weren't that many, which said, probably it's going to get worse with COVID.
Yeah.
But obviously, COVID was the issue, and AMR was sidelined. And I wonder whether now it's coming back. The attention is coming back now that we're living with COVID or trying to figure out how to live with it.
And like the way that it's not going to be not as dramatic, right? It's much more of a slow issue. And do you see that impacting how the research, or how that field is addressed politically and being a problem, or is it?
Yeah, so I interviewed a physician for my work on AMR, and I thought he made a really good point by saying that, if, let's say, as he gave this example to me, so he said, let's say your grandmother dies of a pan-resistant pneumonic infection, you will probably not go to your relatives and friends and say, my grandmother died because of a pan-resistant infection, but you will say, my grandmother died because of pneumonia.
Yeah.
right? So the way we talk about it is already shifts the attention, and also to sort of the awareness of AMR in the public mind.
Yep.
And I think that's what makes it really difficult, because it's not got this crisis discourse.
Yeah.
Right. We don't necessarily have these numbers that we can directly always attribute to AMR and say, this is how many people died this year. It's really tricky to get the gravity and scope of AMR out and sort of put in simple terms. How do you narrate that, especially when it's not just one disease?
Yep. Yeah, and then connected is political perception in the public, which impacts political will and things like this. Yeah, it's really difficult. Yeah.
So it's tricky to, I think, to make it really as snappy.
Yeah.
In a way that.
Yeah.
I mean, the crisis discourse and the securitization then often gets a lot of political attention and funding. Then, right? You know this.
Yeah.
It's your research.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And with AMR, it's a bit different.
Yeah.
Because it's not this. We have one infection that spreads, and if we don't do anything, it'll spread globally and become the next pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you said, it's much more creeping.
Yeah.
Unnoticed, and maybe that makes it more dangerous even.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, so fascinating, really interesting areas of research. And I guess just finally then, would you have any advice for students thinking about trying to enter the field of global health, or as studying, or
again, very good question. It's such a broad field, right?
Yeah. And
I quite enjoy this area, which is at the nexus of research, but maybe be a bit relevant to real life.
Yeah.
if one can.
Yeah.
But advice, I don't know. I think what I'd like to see more is creativity in how we think and conceptualize global health.
Yeah.
Not just look at health systems building block or the insufficient funding structures of the World Health Organization, but maybe completely move out of these frameworks. It's tricky. I don't know how to do it either.
Yeah.
But I would like to see maybe more creativity. And there are scholars who are doing that. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I think, that would be something I would tell students, is to maybe not just stick to the disciplines that they do their program in, but, to think outside of that and really get creative in how they understand health and disease.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think the picture you painted of global health really represents an area of investigation that can be creative, right? Like you say, having such a broad applicability and areas of kind of understanding and areas of interest, and the way it cross-cuts a number of different kind of issues.
Absolutely. And I think it's also the way we can teach students, right? We can really get creative. And I've heard you talk about your teaching and you doing, different sort of board games, for example, because they also teach you something about health and disease and more of that, right? So
definitely. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Sophie, for participating in the podcast. Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. This was really good fun. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Snapshots podcast. Please see the show notes for more information on our guest.